The gates of the south were not made of wood or stone, but of water. For centuries, the Song dynasty had mocked the Mongol horsemen from behind the barrier of the Yangtze River and the jagged mountains of the south. But Kublai Khan was no longer a man of the steppe. He was becoming the master of the tides. To shatter the Song, he did what no Mongol had ever dared. He traded his horses for a forest of masts. He ordered the construction of a staggering 5,000 ships, manned by 70,000 sailors and marines recruited from across his cosmopolitan empire. But even with a navy, the gateway to the south remained locked at the fortress of Shenyang. For 6 grueling years, the city resisted, a strategic nightmare that stalled the Mongol advance. The stalemate was only broken when Kublai looked to the west, importing engineers from the Levant to build the Hui Pao, massive Muslim trebuchets capable of hurling stones that weighed hundreds of pounds. When the walls of Shenyang finally crumbled under the weight of foreign engineering in 1273, the heart of the Song was exposed. The Yuan fleet sailed down the Han River and into the Yangtze like a predatory god. By 1276, the Mongol forces stood at the gates of Linen, the most prosperous city on the planet. Kublai, ever the intellectual conqueror, forbade the traditional slaughter, wanting to preserve the wealth of his new jewel. The 5-year-old Song emperor was taken into custody, but the ghost of the dynasty refused to die. It ended in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen, a naval collision of over 1,000 ships. When all hope was lost, the Song chancellor seized the 7-year-old child emperor and leaped into the freezing ocean, drowning the legacy of the Song in a single, symbolic act of defiance. For the first time in history, China was unified under a foreign hand. Kublai Khan stood at the absolute zenith of human power, stretching his empire from the frozen Siberian tundra to the tropical island of Hainan. He opened the roads of Central Asia, creating the Pax Mongolica, a period where trade and science flowed like blood through a new global body. It was this spirit of openness that brought 2 Venetian merchants, Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, to the imperial palace in 1274. With them was a 21-year-old Marco Polo, whose keen eyes and sharp mind fascinated the great Khan. Kublai appointed the young European to official posts, using him as an objective observer in a court filled with intrigue. But beneath the silk and the science, the iron was beginning to rust. Kublai's vision was of a Sinocentric world where every nation bowed to the Yuan. He demanded submission from Japan, but his envoys were met with silence and insult. In 1274, his first invasion of the Japanese archipelago failed, costing 13,000 lives. 7 years later, he organized a second expedition that redefined the scale of medieval war: 150,000 soldiers and 4,600 ships. It was the largest naval armada the world would see until the modern era. But the gods of the sea were not Mongols. A freak, unseasonable typhoon, the kamikaze, or divine wind, swept the fleet, drowning 75% of the invasion force. The conquest of Japan was abandoned forever, a humiliating scar on the face of an invincible emperor. 1281 was the year the light began to fade. Not only did the sea swallow his fleet, but the earth swallowed his soul. His wife, Chabi, much more than a consort, but his advisor and only true friend, passed away. The loss shattered Kublai's health and his resolve. 5 years later, his eldest son and crown prince, Xinjin, the man he had meticulously groomed to inherit the Yuan throne, died prematurely. The emperor was left a hollow man in a golden palace. He withdrew from the state he had built, seeking solace in excessive food and drink, rotting within the splendor of Kanbalik as gout and depression took hold of his body. The Mongol nobility watched this decline with sharpening knives. They hated the silk, they hated the Chinese rituals, and they hated the way Kublai had abandoned the traditions of the steppe. In 1287, his own cousin Nayan, a descendant of Genghis Khan's youngest brother, led a massive rebellion in Manchuria. It was the final insult. The 72-year-old Kublai was forced to mount his horse one last time, personally leading his army to crush the rebellion and execute his kin. He won the war, but he had lost the argument. The Mongol Empire was now a collection of warring cousins, unified only by a name that no longer meant anything. Even as his internal world collapsed, the gears of the Yuan machine continued to grind. His armies bogged down in the vertical jungles of Vietnam and the heat of Burma. Though he eventually forced these states into tributary status, the cost in Mongol blood was astronomical. His own son, Togon, was banished in disgrace after a humiliating retreat from the Vietnamese front. By the time Kublai reached his final days in 1294, the Iron Radiance was a flickering candle. He died at the age of 78, a man who had conquered everything and lost everyone. He left the throne to his grandson, Timur, inheriting an empire that was both a miracle and a tragedy. In just 22 years, the Yuan Dynasty had become a cosmopolitan superpower where Persian astronomers, Korean sailors, and Chinese scholars lived under a strict iron hierarchy. Trade boomed, science flourished, and religions coexisted in a peace that the world had never known. But the warrior spirit of the steppe had been traded for the luxury of the palace. The Mongol storm had passed, leaving behind a new China and the seeds of empires yet to come. The dragon had been tamed by the very land it sought to conquer.